Okay, so we're going to talk about what alternative agriculture is and why it matters, a little bit from a theoretical perspective and a little bit of empirical work that I've done on it. So everybody thinks that agri-food systems need to change. Whole literature on that, won't discuss it that much, but nobody really agrees on how. Do we need more of the same? Do we need nuclear power to make food in reactors and warehouses, or we need something like this? One family that's more in that direction is agroecology, which is just basically the statement, we need an agriculture that is more tightly coupled with the environment that it's embedded in. It's a practice, it's a science, it's a movement. This framework is helpful as we go forward. I'm going to talk about alternative ecological agriculture because no one else uses this term, so we don't have any baggage, hopefully, because we're getting definitional. And so if we're transitioning to it, we need to know what it would look like, how we would track our progress, and how to promote it. And so we really need to be clear about what we're talking about. There's basically 4 definitions on which people draw a dimension on which they draw a definition of alternative ecological agriculture. People talk about what you can't do. They talk about suites of things that you could do and ways to put them together in principles and toolkits. They talk about who's doing it, and they talk about how it's working. And those are 4 ways that we could use. We could use multiple ones at the same time, possibly. To talk a little bit, prescription, what you can't do. That's the framework. 90% of certified organic is about what you can't do. There are other things, like grass-fed is not really about grass. It's about not feeding grain. Now, a lot of people will say that certified organic doesn't mean anything. That is very much untrue. It is precise about something. It's one of the only sets of definitions that you can use that can sort everything into is or isn't. It might be inaccurate in terms of being a definition of ecologically friendly agriculture, but it is precise. That's an important horse for me to ride on right there. Anyway, another set is we have these like toolkits, integrated blank management, and also conservation agriculture fall into that. If you're a groovy hippie like me, like permaculture is a bit of a toolkit. And a lot of these toolkits out there, like integrated pest management, tend to be about cultivating ecosystem processes and using design and monitoring to reduce your costs, reduce your inputs, hopefully increase yields. It's very hard to sort systems into is or is it ain't for these. We'll talk about that more later. Movements, a lot of people talk about small farmers. They talk about who more than what they're doing, including La Via Campesina claims to be the largest social movement in the world. We have a chapter here in Vermont, rural Vermont. And their basic theory of change is that we get an ecologically friendly agriculture if we focus on letting small farmers do what they want to do and getting away from corporate agriculture that's driven by profit. Whether or not you agree with that, that's one theory of change. And then there are other sets of definitions, right, that are supposedly about performance, right? When we say regenerative or sustainable agriculture, we would really hope that we're referring to a specific change or not change in the resource base, right? If it's sustainable agriculture, right? If it's regenerating natural processes, then it's regenerative agriculture. That would, unfortunately, usually sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture are used to talk about toolkits. Same thing with climate smart agriculture. Those toolkits, there might be a lot of science that they usually have the desired results, but the results aren't what defining what it is, and not what is used to sort things into this is a farm that uses that, this isn't. Alternatively, computer models are used a little bit to do results-based definitions, and then there's one footnote right there that we can talk about in the questions if you want, but I don't have time, of an actual market-based, performance-based definition. So why is it important to keep things straight? One thing is in science, so the term sustainable agriculture sometimes means performance, sometimes means toolkits. Some people take it to mean both. They study only systems in here, but if you're doing a meta-analysis of only systems in here, it doesn't help you answer the question, which is hopefully you want to know how big is this overlap, right? And you end up with a tautology of sustainable agriculture is sustainable, therefore it's sustainable. What else can happen if we conflate? So an interesting thing in science is a debate in organic agriculture, whether it's due to what farmers are not doing or what they have to do because they're not doing those things. So a great example is they can't use the same types of fertilizers, so they might use crop rotation. So if you see better environmental outcomes, is it because they're not using fertilizer, or is it because they are using crop rotation? If it's the latter, maybe you should just encourage conventional farmers to rotate crops more. What happens when we conflate? This is the classic example. People buy organic to support small farmers. Organic's just as consolidated as any other part of the food industry, if not more so. And then in policy, we need to keep our definitions straight because otherwise we can't say whether we're going forward or backward. No-till is big in the United States, it's getting bigger. Some people might say it's an agroecological transition because it improves soil health, but it's based on herbicide and GMOs. And so we have to have a definition so we can say, are we going forward or are we going backwards? So the empirical work, very quickly, I use the framework of integrated pest management, which everybody agrees is a good thing. It's about how to use less pesticides, and it's how it's dealt with in 22 different ecological or social agriculture certifications. So the results, we have 4 organic standards that are all about what you can't do, not surprising. 9 that pretty much just said you have to do planning and keep records. We had 4 that used a suite of optional practices, so kind of a bit of a toolkit definition, which is supposedly what IPM is. 4 used a performance model with maximum pesticide load, and 3 actually really told you how to do pest management. Note, I did not talk about this as a way to define globally what alternative agriculture is. A little bit more on that later. You note that these 3 that tell you exactly how to do it vary geographically and crop specific. So wine grapes in California, for instance. Another way to look at it, 41% are just about planning and record keeping. We have about a fifth that use hybrid definitions, and the rest, as I showed before. So looking a little bit deeper, there were 10 certifications that weren't crop or region specific. They could apply to any farm growing anything anywhere. Of these, 1 used a toolkit-based scorecard. You had to get a certain score in various areas to qualify. Other than that, all of the ones that could apply broadly were either entirely prescriptive, entirely about record keeping and planning, or a combination of the 2. So when we talk about planning, I fit that within movement definitions of alternative agriculture. So fair trade is one of the definitions that was systems that was operationalizing IPM simply through planning and record keeping. Small farmers probably don't want to spray their families with more pesticides than they need to. So planning and record keeping can also, maybe move that forward and help farmers to do that. So that could be a movement-based definition, but it also could be a greenwashing movement in the other direction, right? Say we use IPM without really having any rigorous standard. But the prescriptive definitions of IPM, like the ones that tell you exactly how to do it with grapes and apples, they demonstrate why global definitions of alternative agriculture can't be prescriptive. So EcoApple, which does Champlain Orchards, does EcoApple in Vermont. They're under this standard for 15 different pests. This is exactly what they can and can't do. This is the first 2. You can imagine that's 1 region, 1 crop. If we're going to do that all regions, all crops, the definition of alternative agriculture is thousands of pages long. That's because it's about ecological context, and so our global definitions have to be based on prescription, but we know that prescriptions can ignore context. Toolkits and principles, but verifying can be a little squishy. Movements in politics, but sometimes farmers are more interested in things other than ecological farming. Sometimes peasants, that's not what their first priority. And performance, but real monitoring is usually cost prohibitive. So we have 4 different dimensions on which definitions of alternative agriculture can be made. And there are a lot of different implications of them, and we need to keep our criteria straight if we want to have sort of informed conversations about moving forward. So what are my future research directions on this? I don't know. Maybe you can help me with that. So thanks so much. This is one of my truths from my earlier career.
Got 3 minutes for questions. So you said a lot of things that I maybe, anyway, I'm curious if you said moving forward or moving backward, and we need a definition to hone in on that.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit more about that?
So,
what a definition would look like to actually be able to do
so
that?
for instance, if you're really interested in sort of like the organic agriculture framing of what ecological agriculture is, then if we're expanding, so in the American Midwest, more and more farmers are giving up the plow and they're spraying a lot of herbicide and growing GMO crops, but they're giving up the plow. And some people see that as moving in the wrong direction because it's like sort of more consolidated, more chemically intensive, more kind of like at war with nature. And some people see that as good because we have a lot of reasons to believe that no-till is better for soil health. And so if we clarify that the way that we're thinking about it, then we can see how different definitions sort of put it in one category of, oh, that's moving forward, that's progress, and another set of definitions would put us into, oh, we're going backwards, that's awful. Does that make sense?
That seems like it was still, one definition could kind of house both of those.
Yeah.
Depending on how you find going back to nature or fitting with the environment.
Yes, it's certainly true, and that's just like, these are not these are not 4 definitions, they're 4 axes for definitions. Thanks for that clarification.
Could you discuss a little bit further why you focused on movement politics as opposed to a more formal impact?
So partially that comes from that comes from the agroecology literature, where it's considered a movement, a science, and a practice, and it also, and I think this is why it shows up in the literature, is that a lot of alternative agriculture really takes the form of a bottom-up social movement, and that's true in the United States. It's very true in Latin America, and that's sort of both a framing that I took from the literature and also sort of seems apparent. So it could also, so part of it is sort of just clarifying disagreements. So instead of and clarifying where our own definitions come from, right? So so people could disagree on the definition, but they could be clear about why they disagree. Instead of, and maybe that would cause some disagreements to be, better articulated as this is no longer, maybe this is an ideological disagreement, or maybe it's an empirical disagreement. And a lot of times it gets fuzzy.
USDA organic definition, at least we know what it is. We can
So
disagree
it,
with it.
yeah, like it changes a bit with the regulatory environment, but it's generally like fairly transparent and fairly, like you can go and read it and you can say this is good or this is bad. And that's like really helpful for consumer facing work, but that might not be the best, at the same time might not be the best policy for work that faces in another direction. Does that make sense?
Any questions? Our transition time, if anyone wants to move, is now, but keep on back.
You mentioned there was one certification, there was land something.
So many of you may be, so this is just, I don't know what's going to happen with this, but so this results-based or performance-based certification scheme that just came out that has a bunch of scientists at I think like 5 different universities worldwide is land to market, and that comes from the really controversial and fascinating rangeland biologist, ranching consultant Alan Savory, which many of you are probably familiar with his TED Talk about like cows green the desert. He's also the founder of Holistic Management, and so he has this new program that he's trying to put out there that would do, and he has a bunch of different partners that would do rangeland monitoring and connect that directly to, like, you are in the program and your products can be licensed from it if your rangeland condition is like improving or stable at a certain sort of healthy level. And if it's declining or stable at an unhealthy level, then you're not in it. So that would be very much a performance-based standard.
Okay, we have